Dear friends, good evening. Happy to see you here on our channel, Free Russia Forum channel. Today our guest is famous Russian-American historian, author of many bestsellers, Yuri Felshtinsky. Yuri, hello. Hello. Let's start with the guy whom we're tired of quite a bit, but we can't avoid talking about him. This is Donald Trump. He is now backing off, and when he talked to Giorgia Meloni, he wasn't blaming Zelensky for waging the war, yet he rebuked him for not working very well. So what kind of swings we see here in Trump's politics? Because oftentimes one of his statements contradicts the other, and within a few days his rhetoric changes significantly. I think it's not a swing. I think it's a pretty stable, a long-standing position. Many people are confused about this position. Some people panic, some people question it. But I think in order to understand what we're dealing with, it is easier to look at Trump as if it was Putin. Just imagine that it is not Trump in the White House, it is Putin, and all negotiations that are held by Ukraine with the White House, Europe with the White House. In fact, these are all talks with Putin. And this negotiation process is a process with Putin. And then everything that's happening and everything that's said, we will see as logical and natural, because that's something that's been dealing with for 3 years and a half as minimum, or even 11 years if we count it from 2014. Because the person we're talking to when we discuss Ukrainian matter, and in fact not only Ukrainian matter, and Ukrainian matter is probably the most prominent one, but in fact the person we're talking to is Putin. He just wears the mask of Trump in the White House, because for all this time Trump didn't make any move that wouldn't be beneficial for Russia for all this time. That's why I'm using this example quite often. When Dmitry Medvedev called Donald Trump Colonel Daniil Fedorovich Trump, Medvedev revealed some sort of truth for us, that it is Colonel Stiglitz, a Russian spy, sits in the White House. And this is what we're dealing with, and we need to understand this very well and clearly see it in order to make correct decisions on our side. I mean, Ukraine, Europe. There won't be any shifts here, and they can't be. Of course, there are people around Trump, and of course, he has a team. Some of them have no principles at all, and they're on Trump's side because it is beneficial for them. Some people have illusions, hopes. Some people have misunderstanding, and they don't understand that Trump is Stiglitz, Russian spy in the White House, and they hope that somehow they can change Trump's point of view and they can move him somewhere. I'd say that these hopes are illusory. They can't move Trump anywhere, if even there are people there. And there is a big question mark if there are people there who really want to move Trump in some matter, like Ukrainian matter, or in Greenland matter, or European matter, or Canada matter. I don't think they can manage it. I think if they'll try to push their policy, they'll end up being fired by Trump. And I think We will see these resignations quite soon. Recently, I had Yevgenia Chirikova as a guest here, and she's making this documentary that's called Prisoners. It's about Ukrainians who were taken to Russia or who were put in prisons in concentration camps on the occupied territories of Ukraine. She mentioned this episode to me, and people don't really talk about it much. This is the argument that Zelensky, Trump, and Vance had in the Oval Office. And she said that Zelensky brought pictures of people who went through the Russian prisons, people who were exhausted, who lost weight, who were not medically treated. And he showed these pictures to Trump and Vance so that both of them could actually understand what's been happening. And when they're trying to divide territories and they call all these things as like a good card or a deal, they're using all these game words. But Trump and Vance, they kind of pushed away those pictures. They decided not to look at them, and I think it's quite an indicative moment. Well, this moment, yes, it is indicative and it's pretty expected moment. I wouldn't expect any other reaction from Trump and Vance, because Vance became the vice president on the one hand as the representative of ultra-conservative wing of the Republican Party, let's call it this way, and on the other hand, as a person who lay under Trump in all these matters that Trump is concerned about personally. And because Trump, as a person without principles, I don't think that he literally sticks to conservative views. In fact, he started his career and his first attempt to become the president, he started as a Democrat, not as a Republican. So in this way, Trump has no principles. So I would say they have like a working agreement, Trump and Vance. Vance is allowed to push the program of ultra-right program of the Republican Party, and that's why he supports Trump in all matters, and we can see that. So I'm not surprised by that at all. At the beginning of our conversation, you said that we should look at the White House as if Putin is in it. I automatically compared this situation and the situation when Putin was meeting the hostages who were freed from Hamas's captivity. And he said that we need to thank Hamas for releasing those hostages. And in front of him, Putin has the guy who's been shot in his legs and who lost his father there, and Putin suggests that they should thank their torturers. I think we can make a parallel here with what was happening in the Oval Office, right? Well, it's a similar reaction. Now it is such a time when all these people don't have to be shy about anything. And finally, they can act the way they want, the way it's natural for them, and say what is natural for them. Because let's remember Putin or Medvedev, and actually Medvedev is more sort of indicative example and more interesting. They used to speak a different language when they appealed to the West, and they smiled to the West, and they always made an impression that they were pretty sane and civilized people. And when I discuss these matters now, sometimes people tell me, so Medvedev was a completely different person back then. He wasn't different. he was exactly the same. It's just he had a lot of things that held him back. And for many, many years, they were not saying what they wanted to say, and they acted not the way they wanted to act. And now, finally, they got rid of all the chains and restrictions, and now they act naturally. And that's why we see all of this. And now they're real. This is something they were aiming at. And in their view, for this, in order to get it, they were humiliating themselves, they were pretending, and they were acting unnaturally for all these years. And for all this humiliation, they hated us and the West, that we made them act so unnaturally. And now all this surfaced up. And that's why we can see what we're dealing with. And could you tell us, please, what's happening to the universities? Because it's not only anti-Semitism fight and attack of Trump's administration at the universities in the United States, because those universities, they have great research programs. And Trump's administration now is attacking Columbia University, Harvard University, University of Massachusetts. And since you're an American and you're a scientist, and you know what federal grants are, and when they write to us and say that federal grants are like really nothing, it's like pennies for professors to get their pay. Yeah. So why they say that? Let's just kind of clarify this matter for them a little bit more. Well, see, the whole thing started against the backdrop of anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli protests after October 7 of 2023, after Hamas's attack on Israel. And this is what happened next. Covering it with the fight against anti-Semitism, and I have to say that it has nothing to do with the fight against anti-Semitism. Both Trump and Vance, they're trying to fight against freedom in the United States. And as usual, universities are always part of the, say, liberal wing of politics. And traditionally, universities are always liberal institutions, and liberalism in the United States is the main enemy of Trump and Vance. The main enemy, because the main enemy today for Putin, by the way, and for Trump, it is the world democracy. And the world democracy is concentrated in 3 points, so to speak. Of course, it's broader, there are more other points, but in the United States, it is the Democratic Party, liberal democracy. Sometimes it's more left than we would like it to be, but what to do? This is also Europe, and if we don't include here Hungary of Orban and Italy that is moving towards the right. But Europe in general is a democratic continent, and Canada, if we are talking about North America. So these democratic forces, as we can see, Putin is fighting with, and Trump too. And as part of our conversation, let's look at Trump and Putin like one single whole, because they have the same goals and pretty much the same methods. And that's why now we see Trump's attempt to subjugate universities to the federal government. This idea for the United States is new. In fact, it never got to such a level of idiocy, because idiocy implies an operation or planning that can be 100% successful. Trump, since he acts as the President of the United States and he has majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and he also has the Supreme Court of the United States on his side, Trump has quite a unique political field when all the branches of power are in his hands, and he uses it, and he does it pretty openly and pretty impudently. And so far, in general, the Supreme Court, and we have to say that all Trump's directive statements and orders are submitted to the Supreme Court, and they consider it, and the Supreme Court takes his side. And I'm sure that in Trump's conflict with Harvard, the Supreme Court will be making a decision in this case, and we'll see how the story ends. But since for such people like Trump and Vance, universities are a nest of free thinking, and as the famous quote goes, knowledge is the plague and studying is the cause. In fact, literally, their idea is to completely destroy Harvard University and ruin it completely. And since Harvard University is a symbol not only of the United States, but mostly of the United States, and of course, if this attempt of Trump is successful with Harvard University, then all other universities will realize that they will lose the fight if they resist Trump. I don't know whether the universities will try to act together with Harvard against the administration. I don't know if they have tools and capabilities for that. Formally speaking, a university is a charitable organization that has a charitable status, and it's important because the money that people donate to those universities, to charitable organizations, this money is tax deductible. And put it in simple terms, that when you donate $2, then in reality you donate just $1 from your pocket. And if the universities are deprived of the charitable status, and this is what Trump is trying to do, the university will lose the opportunity to collect donations. And the universities actually live due to these donations, and people who became famous, who studied in those universities, they donate to the university they graduated from. So that's why Trump's idea is to destroy Harvard University. And if he succeeds, then other universities will realize that this is a very dangerous path for them, and they probably need to find some sort of compromise with the federal government, and so on and so forth. This is what's happening, and this is a very principal matter for the United States, and not only for Harvard University, because in fact, the American education that existed for such a long time and that made America great will disappear. So all actions that Trump undertakes, he undertakes them in order to destroy the United States, including the area of education. And we'll see how this battle ends. But in fact, this is a very serious and very important point. I think lately on Deutsche Welle there was a big article with a world map and the zones of influence. And the article says that Trump and Putin and maybe Xi Jinping, they will be dividing the world into different zones of influence, and we need to get ready for Yalta conference, another Yalta conference. And we asked this question to Garry Kasparov, and Kasparov said that there are no any preconditions for Yalta conference because Yalta conference was the result of 1945, and it's a far-fetched for Putin to be Stalin. So do you think there is such a probability? Well, Yalta conference is probably not a good comparison, and they often use it because Yalta treaties, they actually brought us to that after-war, post-war system when they actually legitimized the division of Europe to the western and to the eastern part. We can talk about it, whether it was just, proper, reasonable, but there was a war. And the war in which Americans participated as allies together with the Soviet Union and the UK, and we shouldn't be blaming neither Americans nor Brits, but in fact we can make quite serious claims to both countries. But right now we are not talking about the Yalta conference. We are talking about the division of the world that was done by Stalin and Hitler in 1939. I think it's a more proper association. And Trump sincerely believes, and again, as we said, that Trump is actually Putin, that in this world there are only three powers that can discuss matters. This is Russia, China, and the United States. As Trump said quite a while ago, he said that there is no anybody to talk to. There are only three leaders in the world that should be dividing the world. That's it, just these three, and no one else to talk to. And this is what's happening, with one reservation, that this brilliant plan of dividing the world cannot be realized until Ukraine is fully conquered. So the whole thing is kind of stumbling over Ukraine. So Ukraine is a cornerstone because Putin cannot go to Europe until Ukraine is occupied. And in order to realize this plan, Putin needs to get to Europe, because then Europe will be destroyed by the war, no matter what the type of war it will be and who will win in this war. And the United States, in this scheme, will be great again, as it happened during the Second World War. In fact, in the First World War there was a similar situation, but the most vivid example is the Second World War. That's why everything is about Ukraine, because Ukraine has the most capable army in Europe, and this army has been fighting almost for 4 years or 11 years, depending how you count it. And this army is holding Russian aggression. So it's all about Ukraine. So that's why we see such an incredible pressure that Trump puts on Ukraine, because Trump understands that without conquering Ukraine, you can't move to Europe. Trump-Putin understands that until Ukraine is conquered, Russia doesn't have the army to attack Europe. This is what's happening. That's why pressure on Ukraine will be only growing from Trump, Putin, and this pressure, and we see what's happening in terms of military. We see that Ukraine is bombed, its civilians are bombed, and civilian structures are bombed, facilities are bombed. But political pressure will grow as well, because Putin, after his experience of 2014 and 2022, he understands that he cannot conquer Ukraine in a military way. The speed that he is moving forward, when we look at the map, so they're moving somewhere, it's like they just conquered one village, then another village, then they took over a little town. But this speed is not enough in order to occupy whole Ukraine. That's why Putin's only hope is to take over Ukraine through surrender. When he brings Trump to the negotiations instead of himself, and people won't see that Trump is actually Putin. So this is what's happening. And Trump, as a good con man, he always plays his cards, his good cards. He gets these cards out of his sleeve, and he throws these cards into the game. So you don't want to surrender just like that. So okay, fine. So give us your minerals. So you don't want to give us your minerals? Okay, give us Gazprom. All the time he needs to be in the negotiations process, because if the negotiation process ends, then Zelensky goes to the Europeans and says to them, friends, you see, we've done everything we could. The negotiation process with Trump Putin is over. So give us weapons and let us win in the war. And this is what's going to happen as soon as this negotiation process is over. And since Putin and Trump understand it, and they do everything that's in their power in order to keep the illusion for everybody that Ukraine is taking part in the negotiation, that Ukraine is negotiating with us. They want to agree, they want to make peace, they don't want people to be killed. This is what Ukraine does, and Putin does everything for Ukraine. So they create this illusion. So until this illusion exists, the illusion of the negotiations, Europe won't be reconsidering the strategy of war. And nevertheless, let's hope that the time works against Putin and works for Ukraine and for Europe, and in some way it is so. And it is also another reason why everybody pretends that there is an illusion of agreements, negotiations, talks, that there is some peace process going on, or there is an attempt to find a peaceful solution for the war. And it's not like an illusion, it's more like a pretension that is beneficial for all of parties, for Trump, for Putin, for Europe, because Europe needs to allocate money for defense and to begin to produce something for real. And it is beneficial for Ukraine, because everybody is getting used to this new situation, and the new situation is that there is no NATO anymore, and there is no American support anymore, American assistance. and we shouldn't count on it, because Ukraine won't get a single dollar from America. Not a single dollar, no matter what the conditions will be, whether they sign any deal, any mineral deal, whether Trump is going to get Gazprom or not, Ukraine won't get a single dollar from the United States. And I think everybody understands it in Ukraine. And I think they don't have any illusion about it. Zelensky is under massive pressure. And from all sides, they throw at him that he doesn't want peace and Putin wants. And even representatives of the political immigration from Russia, who in the beginning of the war were supporting Ukraine, right now they're writing some horrible things. Even Yulia Latynina, if you know who I'm talking about. Let me interrupt you. Yulia Latynina is actually the one who is promoting interests of the FSB, of the Federal Security Service of Russia. This is what Yulia Latynina has been doing for many, many years. She's a public figure. So let's put her aside. She's not even, right? So she's, no, the same I meant to say. Yes, okay, the same Yulia Latynina. Okay, so sorry, I didn't hear you properly. So to me, it's surprising because at the beginning of the full-fledged invasion, for a long time, Mikhail Podolyak, the representative of Ukrainian government, used to come to her streams, and Mikhail Podolyak didn't manage to crack her, so to speak. And Mikhail Podolyak is a famous media manager in Ukraine, and I think he knows precisely who these people are who work for secret services. Well, in fact, we don't need to crack anybody. We just need to listen and read what people are writing and saying. And Aristovich, as you remember, he was different. Something happened to him. The same as to Medvedev, as they say. But Aristovich, by the way, let me interrupt you. Back in 2010 or at the beginning of 2000s, Aristovich was noticed with such guys like Dugin, philosopher Dugin, the ideologist of Russia, and all this unity stuff that brought us to the ideology of Russian world. Actually, Aristovich was the one who was promoting this idea. So that's why actually he kind of smelled it. So I didn't study Aristovich. I listened to his streams with Mark Fagin, and those streams back then at the beginning of the war were quite popular. And then his streams with Fagin ended, and then for some reason he started having streams with Yulia Latynina, and in those streams he was saying absolutely surprising things. So that's why let's forget about Latynina and Aristovich. We need to understand that Putin's goal, one more time, is that since he cannot take over Ukraine in a military way, he wants to make Ukraine surrender, to make it agree with annexation, make a promise not to join NATO, and to organize new elections. And the trick with this new election is that idea of Putin-Trump is that in this election the candidates will be from Moscow, and through this they will complete the takeover of Ukraine. Because first, Ukraine should agree with the annexation of the territories that Russia wants today, and the second part of the annexation will be that the president appointed from Russia will surrender the rest of Ukraine to Russia. Well, again, let me say that I'm sure that nothing of this will happen. I'm just explaining to you what is the main idea and why we see that now, all of a sudden, they engaged massive forces to explain to the viewers that the main instigator of the war is Zelensky. And we hear it both from Russian propagandists and from Putin and Medvedev, which is not surprising, and from Trump, which is not surprising either, because Trump is Putin. That's why all the forces are engaged into achieving this goal. But for the person who is not fully immersed in what's going on, the whole thing seems to be insignificant. For example, if the President of the United States wants the President of Ukraine resign, why not? Why shouldn't Zelensky resign if this is the key stumbling block? But in fact, it is not the key stumbling block. The stumbling block is that Ukraine doesn't want to surrender. So this is the key point. And that's why when we see such powerful political operations, PR operations, and propaganda operations, in the security services terms, they call it burning your agents. When the operation itself is so important that for its success they expose even those agents who stayed in the dark before, because otherwise they could have exposed themselves as agents. So that's why we see that Latynina is speaking different language and Arestovich is speaking different language, and actually Trump is speaking different language as well. So, and it's clear about Trump. So that's why many people who seem to be kind of quiet and had a different point of view, and they didn't speak up about certain things, all of a sudden they're like mad dogs. They're raging in this direction because this is the instruction, this is the guidelines, because everything is engaged, because this is what's important, to make Ukraine surrender. Some of them had this reasonable idea that if we make Zelensky resign, that everything will collapse. That actually happens quite often in such situations. And after that, there will be such a chaos and havoc that nobody will understand anything. And as a result, Ukraine will surrender and will get to the peace plan of Putin that was announced in June of 2022, because nothing changed since that peace plan, because back then they wanted Ukraine to agree with annexations and Zelensky leaves and regime in Ukraine changes and Ukraine promises not to join NATO. And then Russia obviously will take over everything. And we hear it every time from Putin, from Vance. In 3 months. 3 months and it's going to be done. And Zelensky, he kind of made a joke about it, but it wasn't really a joke, because he said, so we've heard about it from Putin 3 months. When Vance said something to Zelensky, Zelensky said, we've heard this already from Putin. And Zelensky said, okay, yes, 3 months, we've heard it from Putin. Yes, of course, because all the texts and wording they get from Putin. And when Witkov came to Moscow and spoke to Putin for 4 hours, and then he came to Kiev, and he immediately had this new idea that Gazprom now is the goal. Neftegas, that company that Ukraine has it. So why all of a sudden Witkov had this idea after his visiting Moscow? He didn't know anything about it. Well, they also wanted to get nuclear power plants. Yes, exactly. All these narrations are coming from the Kremlin, from Putin. All of them. Trump, Vance, Witkov, They just announce those texts. And everybody gets somehow an idea that this is some sort of desire of Trump to be like a friendly or neutral, at least, political partner. Trump, Vance, Wittkov, kind of neutral. But in fact, all those texts, all these narrations come from Putin. And Wittkov gave this horrible interview to Carlson, this propagandist who lives on the roof of the Kremlin, so to speak. He gave this interview to Carlson, and he says that nobody sees the elephant in the room. And all these territories, they're Russian-speaking territories. Why not to give them to Russia? So, but what about those German-speaking parts of Austria and Switzerland? So there are Basel and Bern. So, if to use this logic, and he actually uses this logic because he's completely incompetent, and he has as much competence as Carlson has. Well, in fact, he is incompetent. He is probably a very good businessman who sells real estate. And he's been a real estate businessman, and this is how he got to know Trump. But even the competence is not the point. The point is that around Trump there are people who are trying to fulfill the tasks that were given to them. And somehow these tasks incidentally coincide with Putin's tasks. I would like to emphasize that Putin himself wouldn't have done anything differently. That's why we are in such a confusion for several months. But this confusion vanishes pretty quickly if you just understand that you are talking to Putin, not to the President of the United States. There are no many reasons for optimism in this situation because we are losing the United States as an ally, or we've lost the United States. But I want to hope that they're not going to get anything from Ukraine. Well, in fact, I wouldn't agree that we don't have a lot of reasons for optimism. In fact, I think that there are many reasons for optimism. In some way, right now, I look at what's going on with more calm than I used to a year ago. Because I think that the most important thing is to determine the level of threat and to understand what's going on. Because if you don't understand what's going on, then it's impossible to make a proper decision. I'll give you an example. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. Nobody took this event as Russia's invasion of Georgia. There was so much nonsense. They've been communicating from all over the place. One of them was that it's hard to find Georgia on the map, and the American mixes up Georgia with the state of Georgia, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia they're not going to even mention because you can't even see them on the map through a magnifying glass. So it was impossible to explain that issue to anybody. And that's why, if we're talking about the reaction to the Russian invasion to Georgia, that's why nobody could make any proper decision. And the same thing happened in 2014 with Crimea. Lots of nonsense, and Russian propaganda managed pretty well and was quite prepared for this in comparison to the rest of the world where they don't have propaganda. Maybe in China they do, but that's a separate topic. So right now, after Trump came to the White House, because before Trump's coming to the White House, let's be frank, Europe and the United States, they helped Ukraine, but in such a way so that Ukraine would fight the war, but wouldn't win in the war. No way. And now I hope when Trump came to the White House, and given how Trump acts towards Europe, I think that this view of the war will change. Because if it doesn't change, then everything will be flowing the way it's flowing now. And let's put it this way. For the whole Ukraine, this war started in 2022, but for the people of Donbass and Crimea, the war started in 2014, and the war is going on for 11 years. 11 years. Not 3 years. The fourth year now. But 11 years. In the center of Europe. 11 years. There is a war. And for some reason, nobody cares. And let alone people die, and that is expensive after all, and Europe takes part in it financially. But it's not an okay situation for Europe after all, when we're talking about security and welfare of the whole continent. It is not normal when in Europe they have a war for 11 years between two big states. Maybe something should have been done in order to finish the war. Maybe we need to determine in which way we can finish it. There were many attempts, they made many attempts, and we observed them. Macron used to call Putin, and they were giving weapons and then not giving the weapons. And they were closely watching Putin's health, hoping he'll drop dead in a week, and then the war ends, and we were happy about the mutiny of Prigozhin. Maybe Prigozhin will shoot Putin, and then the war will be over. So people have ideas how the war could be finished. But not to finish the war, but somehow the war would finish on its own. But it doesn't. For 11 years, this war doesn't end on its own. Even Stiglitz, the Russian spy, is in the White House, and the war doesn't end anyway. So 24 hours actually passed since then, since the time Trump moved to the White House, and the war is still going. On the 20th of April there will be 3 months, and the war doesn't end. And in fact, let's be frank, we can't see any prospects for Trump and Putin to end the war through surrender. Maybe we can find some other way to finish the war. Maybe finally we'll give Ukraine weapons. Maybe we will remove all the restrictions from Ukraine. Maybe we'll finally let Ukraine use these weapons against Moscow, and maybe in that crazy country something will change. There will be some people who will hear, I mean in Russia, that the war is going on, and that the missiles are falling not only on Kiev but on Moscow as well, and then maybe the moods in Russia will change among people, among government officials. And in this sense, I think that when something is going on, when Europe actually realized the level of threat, yes, finally, they're getting armed. Slowly, yes, slowly, because it's Europe, and it takes a while for Europe to start, and actually everybody in the Western world, it takes them time to actually start moving. But now it is okay to say that Russia is a threat to the European security. Listen, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, it was possible to say that only to the Poles or the Lithuanians. All the others would look at you as if you're crazy. Even 6 months ago, you couldn't say that to the French. I oftentimes come to Strasbourg and I come across journalists, they're Russian-speaking journalists and Ukrainian-speaking journalists, and one of the citizens of Metz town, this town was under occupation of Germany, and its period called their annexation. And 6 months ago, he used to tell me, so does it matter what you're going to be called, Ukraine or Russia? I'm Ukrainian. And he said to me, so do you care how you're going to be called? And I asked him, so for some reason you decided you're French, so did you care how you're going to be called? Besides, there are many German-speaking people there in Strasbourg. If you remember, the names of the streets are doubled in French and in German. And now they say to me, what horrible it is in Sumy. How is it possible to kill civilians? And now this man is writing to me a sympathizing letter. Finally, they get it. Of course, they begin to get it. Because when in France they understand that there is no NATO, that there is no this nuclear umbrella for Europe, and when Macron is saying that France is going to give a nuclear umbrella to the European Union, and we don't hear any sound of protest in France and almost support across the board, well, at least it seems like that from here, from the United States, that this decision is supported. And when they finally begin to form a financial defense bloc, when they have only 700 billion euros, and finally everybody's happy that Germany is getting armed. It's 80 years passed since the Second World War, and now everybody's been happy that Germany is getting armed. So it's a serious shift in Europe. And this shift, it goes without saying, may bring us to a new point of view of the war, to a reconsideration of the situation, and the war could be ended through the victory of Ukraine and the loss of Russia, and not through patient waiting, hoping for Putin's death, and for some reason the whole regime will collapse, and for some reason Russia will become puffy and peaceful. So I think this is the new thing that happened in Europe, this new shift, and only because Trump is in the White House, and only for 3 months, Europe made quite a leap in terms of understanding what the threat is and what should be done. Will Europe do what is necessary, or it won't be capable of doing it? But right now there is an understanding of it, and this is a lot to understand the point of the problem. So thank you very much for such a meaningful talk, and I'm very happy to have this talk with you. And we found optimism on this path, Trump-Putin path. So come to us more, and our audience needs you. Thank you very much. Thank you.